Hi, this is Paul, and I have a sort of a rando today. He's a rando to this channel, and he's never been on my channel. But those of you who are around Sacramento and the Christian Reformed Church probably know this guy. He's a longtime colleague, was actually in seminary when I was, and probably Calvin when I was too. So Kevin and I go way back, and I've been in Sacramento 25 years, and he's been here longer. So he is the pastor of Granite Springs Church in Lincoln, California, which is northeast of Sacramento. If you go out I-80 and you hit 65 and you go up 65 and you keep going, you'll have Roseville and Rockland and Lincoln. And Kevin's way the heck up there. And Kevin and I have known each other a long time. And Kevin has a book called Living Underwater. It's about baptism. So we'll talk about baptism as a way of life. So we'll have him explain that. I don't know, Kevin, Molly Worthen. Do you remember who Molly Worthen is?
Help me remember.
She wrote a book, The Apostles of Reason, which is one of the best history books on neo-evangelicalism, came out about 20 years ago. And she has recently become a Christian, and she teaches history at, I think, Wake Forest. Fascinating interview, but she got rebaptized, which was really funny because she wasn't quite sure about the first time she got baptized. Then she was really unsure about the second time. So there's a lot of some of the Orthodox people. Now, Kevin is good friends with an Orthodox priest, so I know some of the Ortho bros here, another Christian Reformed minister, and you'll sort of be condescending towards him, but Kevin is good friends with an Orthodox priest, and we'll get to that too. And so you might even have an icon behind him somewhere if you look.
He might somewhere. There might be a few around if you really pay attention.
And the fact that a Christian Reformed minister has an icon in his office, boy, you can really tell that we're not in West Michigan anymore. But that's where, well, I don't know. We'll see how far back we can go with Kevin's story. I told Kevin that we were going to do this, and he's like, I said, Kevin, we're going to take a long time in biography. He's like, no, I don't want people to be bored. I said, nah, not this crew, Kevin. You know, the stuff about the book, they'll listen to, but they're really interested in your story. So those of you on the channel know the deal. So Kevin.
Paul.
Welcome to the channel.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Paul's, by the way, one of my favorite people on the planet. So, and has been for a long, long time. So this is, and I always thought he should have a little bit a wider audience than what he had. So it's fun for me to catch up, Paul, to all the things you're doing. It's great fun.
Well, let's begin, Kevin. Let's begin with, how much do you know about where your ancestors came from, the Netherlands? Let's go all the way back there.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so I was able to receive a grant. The Lilly grant goes to pastors. So basically they say, here's a bunch of money, go on a trip. Actually, you have to apply and make a case. So part of my case was, it was the 150th anniversary of the CRC, Christian Reformed Church then. So, I mean, my pitch, just to take a step back, was this: it takes some imagination and some ability to speak to people who aren't necessarily in church all the time, to start a new church, to start a new congregation, especially if you want people to come who have no background in this whole weird thing called the church. So along the way, some models for me, or helps for me, have been J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. So it began with, I'd like to kind of pilgrimage to see some of their life sites. And then, by the way, it's the 150th anniversary of the CRC, so I'd like to go to the Netherlands as well. So a friend of mine, who shall not be mentioned, but he planted a church in Folsom, a CRC in Folsom.
He's been mentioned on the channel before.
Yeah, he grew up in the Netherlands, and I told him about this scheme. Hey, we want to go to this little town in very western or eastern the Netherlands, and see where my ancestors were and where they were buried and where they went to church. And he, in his very The Hague upscale kind of way, said, that's a waste of time. They're all the same. All those little towns are just the same. So Tim, if you're listening, I love you, man. But we went anyway, and it was really quite something. My ancestors We went to this little town, and the janitor, I think, is it Busker in Dutch? But whatever, the janitor was there, just happened to be there, and he's only in church maybe a couple hours midweek cleaning. But we walked up, he was there. He found out I was a CRC minister, found out my family, he didn't speak very much English because it is a small town. But he could not have been more hospitable. He found out, my wife plays the organ. So he said, hey, go up there and play the organ. She's up there playing the organ. He's practicing. The kids are there. He's showing them how they take the offering in the Netherlands with the offering bags and these big sticks. Anyway, we go to the graveyard, and it turns out, this wasn't surprising, my relatives were too poor to have a permanent marker. So they were in the places where you just add people, so to speak. So, but what's interesting, I think, Paul, is I was telling another friend the other day, the church where I grew up in Kalamazoo, Michigan, my ancestors emigrated there in 1904, and someone from our family has been going to that church since 1904.
Wow.
So in terms of passing off the faith from country all the way to California, in a sense, it's kind of remarkable. I mean, that's just no small thing. It's kind of so I, like you, I sort of inherit this legacy with all its warps and weirdness and things, but all its beauty as well. So, or some of it. So that's a ways back there, Paul.
So what kind of jobs did your family do when they got to Kalamazoo, Michigan?
Well, they did immigrant jobs, the jobs immigrants still do now. So my grandfather was like a skilled tradesman, like in the construction business. So he ended up building his own house eventually, which a lot of people did back, in the 1920s, 1930s. So it's fairly modest. But he in his day-to-day job, he worked for the city of Kalamazoo. And while the other long-term non-immigrants would take smoke breaks, he would then do the jobs they didn't want to do. He'd shovel dirt, he'd put up retaining walls, he'd dig trees, he'd do all the things that really immigrants have done for a long time and still do all over the world today. They do the jobs nobody else wants to do because they're cheap labor. Yep. And then on the side, as a side hustle, it was they found a place in Kalamazoo where the dirt was really rich. This is a very Dutch thing, right? And so they planted celery, which again is sort of like a poor man's crop, isn't it? You're not going to make a lot of money off of celery, at least back in those days. And so then early in the morning or late at night, he'd be up to his ankles in muck and working the celery fields. Yeah.
There's a lot of Christian Reformed stories that involve celery and muck.
Like flowers, you can make a little money. You sell a tulip once in a while, you make a little money. But I don't know what. I guess it's what you know, right?
Yeah. I've got a story from my grandmother. So my father's mother grew up in Grand Rapids, on where Lafayette and Jefferson are. Back where Madison Square Church is.
Yeah.
My great grandfather there was working a muck farm, and my grandmother told about how they'd have these planks over because everybody wanted white celery, not green celery. And what now is sort of in the middle of Grand Rapids was just all muck celery fields. So
and that's where they were attracted to West Michigan, right? Rich soil, a lot of sort of swampy, mosquito-y stuff, which looked terrible to us. It looked like paradise to them, right?
Yep. Well, at least
gray skies. They were
somehow they could live, leaving the poverty of the Netherlands.
Right.
Now your father's story is quite interesting too. Why don't you talk a little bit about your father?
Yeah. So my dad is a blue collar guy, comes from a blue collar family. And grew up in Portage, Michigan, so a little south of Kalamazoo. He grew up in the Reformed Church of America, married my mom, who was in the Christian Reformed Church. So if you know a little of these stories, back in 1959, when they got married, this was considered a kind of a crazy, wild, out there pairing, right? Where you have a Reformed Church of America person and a Christian Reformed Church person getting married. This was like Romeo and Juliet kind of stuff. As silly as it sounds now, there was, yeah, I mean, the churches had separated, well, 100 years before my folks arrived, but that kind of we toe the line mentality was still part of things. So my dad enters into the CRC by marriage, is never really completely comfortable with it. I think still to this day, he thinks the music is a little slow. It's a little too serious. It's a little too formal. It's a little too a bunch of these things. And one of the things I like to say about my dad is he's a simple guy, not simple in the sense that he's dumb. He's not dumb. He's really quite intelligent and quite insightful and wise, but simple like God is simple. God is simple in that what you see is what you get in some ways. He is knowable. He is not duplicitous. He's not bifurcated. And my dad was like that. Sometimes people tell stories, right, of, hey, my folks were one way at church. They looked all high and mighty and pious and all this kind of stuff. But then at home, they were a mess, or they were, angry, or they were, belittling and all these kinds of stuff. Well, my dad of us, and I'm one of three boys, so sometimes that impatience was well deserved. But kind of what you see is what you get with my dad. He's like the real deal. He worked for about 40 years at a corrugated place in Kalamazoo. It's sort of paper mill, makes cereal boxes, that kind of thing, for Kellogg cereals. And then his last jobs were being janitors for a Christian high school, and then a grade school afterwards. One of the things the Christian high school did is if people got in trouble, if they had to stay for detention, they'd have to hang out with Sherm. So my dad's name is Sherm. And so Sherm's working theory was that if they were in detention, they'd done some stuff wrong and they probably deserved it. But his working theory was they needed more love more than anything else. So one of my dad's favorite things in the world is Tootsie Pops. So he would start out by giving them Tootsie Pops and let the relationship be. I mean, it's hard to be intimidated with a guy who gives you a Tootsie Pop, even if you're in detention. So yeah, I could tell some more stories about my dad, but he's really one of my heroes of faith. It's been my privilege, and yours too, to really know some remarkable human beings. And I know you feel this way about your dad as well. So my dad is just this authentic emblem of what it can mean to be a follower of Jesus, really, and just really earnest and honest, and I don't want to say uncomplicated because every life is complicated, but yeah, really kind of captivating kinds of ways from a certain perspective. From other ways, it looks just kind of plain, like maybe a plain life, but to me, it looks quite amazing in lots of ways. Yeah.
So you went to church twice on Sunday growing up?
If you went to church only once, you were called a oncer where I grew up, Paul, and it was not good to be a oncer. So yes, so our Sunday went like this. So we got to church about 9:00 for a 9:30 service, which went till about 11. Then we had this thing called Sunday school. And then we went to Grandma's house where we would talk about church. And then in the afternoon, there might be choir practice. And then there was an evening service. And then there was youth group afterwards. And we called that the day of rest. And there were very, very few, like if it snowed maybe more than a foot, someone might think about shutting down church, but they usually wouldn't, I mean, if there was a hailstorm, they might think about shutting down, but they really wouldn't. There's a tornado. Well, if it's only a watch, if there's a tornado near the church, well, probably not, it's that kind of
maybe not the
piety.
evening service.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So yeah, all that.
So what was faith like in your household for you as a child growing up?
Yeah, I think it was really honest and earnest. To put it one way, I mean, we were at church regularly. Like I said before, my grandparents were connected to the church. My great grandparents were connected to the church. So we went to Christian day school. All this kind of reinforced faith. Um, one of the things I think I'd say, well, I really never doubted my faith growing up, which is kind of a crazy thing to say. I doubted the church, which is maybe something we can get back to later as a pastor. I remember being in junior high thinking, this is crazy, and telling my dad, this is crazy. These people are nuts. They're like way too serious and sober. And the first thing the minister would do is in his very serious, kind of pious tone, he would mount this gigantic pulpit. This is the eyes of a kid, and he would say, "This is the day the Lord hath made. We will rejoice and be glad in it." And he would say it with the most sobriety and the ponderousness you could. And I'm like, "This is the day the Lord has made. Are you serious right now?" I mean, to a 12-year-old, that just seems incongruous, to put it mildly. But go back to your question, like faith-wise, we read the Bible with most meals, especially the evening meal. We prayed, and we're taught to pray, not in a robotic. I think we started with Jesus. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord. One of those classics. But we simply, it was just kind of everywhere. It was kind of in the air we breathe, and there's this kind of vitality, and it was life-giving. I'll put it that way. Not always. I mean, as you're a kid, you think I'd rather watch the Lions game. That's saying something, because they were terrible. I'd rather watch the Lions game than go to church. But yeah, you couldn't watch TV on Sunday. So
No, we
solved
couldn't
that
either.
problem too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do remember one time we were camping at Gun Lake. So if you're West Michigan at all, there's this place called Gun Lake. It's where the Reformed people would hang out in the summer. From Michigan, Kalamazoo, Grand Rapids, Holland, some of those little places. And as a Christian Reformed person, we could not swim on Sundays. It's a little ridiculous, but it was well meant, right? You could walk, but you couldn't run. You could walk, but you couldn't swim. You could look at the water, but you couldn't go for a boat ride in the water. You could drive your car, but you couldn't. Anyway, still somewhat, it looks silliness now. Well, we were camping next to my cousins, which was my dad's sister and family. They were Reformed Church of America. Well, so this is one of these 90-degree Michigan days, 98.5% humidity. You breathe, you sweat, and they are in the lake. And we, being Christian Reformed, cannot go in the lake. We can take a shower. In fact, we could take 5 showers, but you can't go in the lake. So on the whole, there's this beautiful faith that gets passed, but in the seams, there's like, what the heck is this? So every generation asks questions, and rightly so, I think, about in some ways making the faith their own for what goes ahead, right?
So people who know the Christian Reformed Church might know that one of the things the Christian Reformed Church really majored in many places, and every place that it could in North America, was sort of establish these Christian day schools, and both of us are products of this system. Right. What's your sense of that in terms of your faith development?
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to imagine my faith developing without it, only because it was my experience. My dad grew up going to public schools, so for him, this was part of what was new and somewhat odd about the Christian school, about this Christian Reformed Church, was this commitment to, no matter what your income. I mean, there was years 25% of his salary was going to Christian schools, and even that wasn't enough. Well, there's just not enough bandwidth at that point. So that was a pretty big sacrifice on their part. For me, to grow up in a place where there were Christian teachers and there was this Christian ethos was a gift. I think I have 2 brothers. One would say his experience in the Christian school in terms of being bullying and in terms of being kind of neglected, or just the bullies just kind of did what they did and nobody interfered. And in some ways, the faculty was kind of complicit with bullying. That's a different
Hmm.
His experience, though he's close to me in age, was a little different than mine. I think, for instance, yeah, I mean, the quality of education, the earnestness of the faith that isn't like overly talked about, but is just lived, was because then there's this congruity, right, between what I experienced at home and what I experienced in school, and there was this connectedness that I think made the whole thing have a kind of integrity that was helpful to me. And then during high school, my teachers just assumed I would go into college. No one in my family had ever gone to college. This was not something anybody did, but I think it, because of them, that I could have this imagination, even assumption in some ways about going. So there's a number of layers in which that was helpful for my own faith. When we moved to Rockland, California here, there was no such school like that. We didn't have a vision of starting a school like that. During seminary, I did a little, one of these papers about how sometimes the Christian school part of the Christian Reformed Church thwarted any kind of connecting to neighbors and to mission and that kind of stuff. So my kids are all part of a public school system here. That was a big deal when the first one was in kindergarten and first grade. This was kind of new to my wife and I, because she's part of a Christian day school in Ripon, which is not that far from here, really. So my kids have a different kind of experience. I think they would say the same connectedness between church folks and their own parents was something they grew up with, but they didn't have that from school. So I think and honestly, there are advantages both ways. I think for them, the kind of having a sense of the wide tapestry of the folks in the neighborhood was just really a helpful gift to them, and kind of launched them into their own kind of unique identity. So it's not a super long answer, but not a short one either, Paul.
Well, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, the beautiful thing about YouTube is there's lots of time. Trust me. I know my goal is to colonize YouTube, and got some competition, but I'm doing my best.
Your Dutch ancestors will be proud.
That's right. Very industrious. So then when did you make profession of faith, and how did that come about? And you should explain what profession of faith is too, because that's sort of connected with this whole business.
Yeah. So different traditions within the Christian tradition do things differently. The church you and I grew up in, of course, we were baptized as children. The idea is you're brought into the covenant of faith. You don't want to wait till you're 10 or 15 or 25.
On the 8th day, if possible.
On the 8th day, if possible. So you're a Hebrew of Hebrews, the St. Paul would say. Yeah. So at the very beginning, the idea, right, is that God from the beginning says, you're mine, you belong to me, and you grow up knowing you belong to me. And at the same time, there's this hope and desire and requirement, some people could say, but this hope and desire that then someone put it this way, that in baptism, it's God reaching down to you and saying, you're my child. In profession of faith, or sometimes confirmation or something similar, then you reach back up to God and say, you're my God. So the covenant then is complete. Now, a good Orthodox person would be baptized. It just saves a lot of time.
You're going to have to back up, because I don't know why your internet's so bad at Granite Springs. You guys do internet stuff all the time.
We do, but I'm kind of in the corner. Maybe if it continues to be bad, maybe I'll switch offices. But I'm kind of at the end.
Oh, okay.
But I'm really kind of the only one in the building today. So it's a strange thing. So where do you want me to back up to? Sorry about that.
But you started talking about the Orthodox, and I know the Ortho bros, their ears would perk up. And Orthodoxy. So the Orthodox, right, as I understand it, from my friend Father Chris and others, you're as an infant, as soon as possible, you're baptized and you're chrismated and you receive Eucharist all at the same time. So like you're in. Are there any questions? We have this thing called profession of faith, which is,
I think is one way we'd say it, right? Or kind of a next.
Oh,
Yeah,
you just
sometimes.
dropped again, right? You're dropping the devil's in here because you're just dropping at the key words. So
Well, you know, Paul, that I have an adverse relationship with technology.
yeah, you want me to pause so you can relocate?
Yeah, why don't we do that? I'll
Okay.
find another office to go to, see if I can do better.
All
All
right,
right.
I'll pause. All right, we're kind of comparing the profession of faith in the Christian Reformed Church and the path in Orthodoxy.
Yeah, so I don't know how much to repeat, Paul, but I'll just say again, in Orthodoxy, this is beautiful, I think, message of you're in, you're in, you're in. You have baptism and you have chrismation, anointing, and you have Eucharist just all at once as a child. And there's this beautiful sense of that you are part of the church. In other sort of Western churches, Catholic churches, Lutheran, Methodist, and its own version in the Reformed tradition, there's this thing called confirmation sometimes, where you confirm your baptism, or profession of faith, where you profess it as your own. So in the church I grew up in, there was this deal that you had to have certain information to make profession of faith. So you would go to the pastor and you would make sure he would quiz you on the Heidelberg Catechism. So I don't know how many of your folks know about that, but basically quiz you on your knowledge of one of the great confessions or catechisms of the church. And being a little bit of in my own sort of Orthodox, I say small o, Orthodox Christian Reformed kid, I was like, profession of faith should not be about what you know. It should be about who you know. So I was a bit of a rebel, Paul, in
That
just
sounds
a
very evangelical.
very mild rebel. So I
If you
just
rebel
called.
against the Christian Reformed Church, you either do it as an evangelical or you do it as a mainliner. You usually go one way or the other.
Yeah, I think I somehow managed to go both ways. We'll talk about that later, maybe too. But yeah, so I just called up the minister one night and said, "Hey, I'd like to prayer to council," and I did. It was that you would be interviewed by the elders and deacons of the church and the pastor. So if you could imagine a gigantic table in a room that seats, let's say, 28 people, and the pastor's on one end, I'm on the other end, and then the elders by seniority are around the pastor, about 6 on one side, 6 on the other. After them come about 12 deacons, so 6 on one side, 6 on the other. And then there's 3 or 4 empty seats, and then there's me at the end. And the pastor is lobbing me questions back and forth. And I must have done okay. I do remember weeping at the end. There's some questions he asked me that just, I think, kind of got deep inside. So I don't remember what they were, but I remember, like for me, that was my heart was strangely warm, Paul. I say that somewhat in jest, but there was a sense in what it was not a robotic mechanical experience. It was a significant experience as well. Yeah.
Now, some kids in the Christian Reformed Church, you kind of go through as a class. So it sounds like it was just you.
Yeah, that was a kind of thing some folks in our church did. You know, you graduate and then you do that together. Or, you know, Matt likes to tell a story. He was baptized because his cousin was baptized and he didn't want to get behind his 9-year-old cousin. So there is all that kind of stuff. But I think it was, for whatever reason, there was something in me that said, this has to be like authentically personal on some level. So evangelical, maybe.
Yeah. So let's talk about call to the ministry. When did that sort of start in you?
Yeah, it's a good question. We CRC people don't talk about dreams very much, but I'll throw this out there. When I was about 8 years old, I had a dream, and it was one of those meet God in your dreams, and God was both terribly scary, as he often is in the Bible, but also approachable in ways I don't think I could put my words on. So I remember running down to my parents. I think this is the only time I did this that I remember growing up, asking if I could sleep on their floor, which I did. And I don't think to this day I've told them about the dream, but it was this sense of, I want to be yours. I want to belong to you and do whatever you want me to do, in this mix of kind of awe and it didn't really feel like obligation, but commitment maybe is a better word. So that is what it is. You know, I'm 7, 8 years old at the time. When I was in high school, I had a couple pastors, a Reformed church pastor, tell me I should think about ministry, and I was like, yeah, whatever. I wasn't paying any attention to that. And then I went to Calvin University, what is now Calvin University, and one of my first classes was with a guy named Dale Cooper. Dale was chaplain of the university, and he's still one of my good friends to this day, but he made the Bible, it was an Old Testament survey course. So basically all the Hebrew scriptures, you kind of take a nice long look at them. And I had covered all this material in Great Christian Day School. I'd covered it in Sunday school. I had covered it in catechism class. I had covered it in certain ways in sermons. But when he communicated it, it was like alive in a different way. And for me, it was like those old televisions pre-internet where you would get the TV antennas just right, and suddenly the fuzz would go to clarity. And when Dale was teaching, I thought, this is what I'm supposed to do. So I remember telling my dad, again, this person of faith, because this was my freshman year. At your sophomore year, if you went into ministry then, as you know, you had to take Latin, you had to take Greek, you had to get your game on. So I thought, well, Dad, I remember being on the back porch in June. I said, I think I'm going to take Latin this fall. That didn't mean anything to him. So I kept going and said, I think I'm supposed to go into ministry. And I'll never forget, my dad paused. He looked at me, just the two of us on the back steps, and said, you don't want to do that. He said, that's a terrible way to make a living. He said, you'll just never and these were his words, you'll never please people. Like, that's a job where people are always going to be anxious, or they're always going to be subversive, or they're always going to make life difficult for you. I mean, he was a man of the church. He loved the church, but he had also observed the real life, the underbelly of the church through a variety of things. And the beautiful thing for me was I really had to do some soul searching after that to say, this is not the answer I expected from my father, my church-going, faithful father. But I did, long story, I did go, at that point, I had no idea what sort of job in the ministry I would do. I just knew I was called to become a pastor. I thought maybe I'd end up like a Dale Cooper and be a chaplain at some point. I didn't know, but that started the journey. Yeah.
It's very interesting because in many ways, your father's answer is very reformed. I mean,
Yeah.
It's not, pastor is kind of the top of the pyramid. No, that's a terrible way to make a living. You're better off, working
Be an
in some
engineer.
fabrication plant in Kalamazoo, Michigan, or cleaning up a Christian school. Why would you want to be a minister of all things?
That's exactly right.
Do you know how we treat them?
Exactly right.
So you go to Calvin, and by your sophomore year, you get into pre-sem and Latin and Greek, and actually they had dropped the Latin requirement by the time what year did you start Calvin?
I started Calvin in the summer of 78.
Okay, so you graduated high school 3 years ahead of me.
Yeah, all so right. You were just in time to miss Latin, were you?
I was just in time to miss Latin. And today, I wish it was still a requirement, because I sure wish I knew a little bit of Latin. Comes up a lot. So anyway, I'm sort of a little jealous of some of my Roman Catholic priest friends who, of course, know a lot of Latin, and it's pretty handy stuff. But you'll have to take. Did you have Robert Otten at Calvin for Greek?
I did not.
I had Weaver.
I had yes. 8 o'clock class, which did me in, I think, because I was also taking. Well, see, I'd finished Spanish, because you had to take a modern language at the time, and Latin and Greek, right? So yeah, that the multiple languages. I mean, I was competent. I passed and all that, but I never felt like I could master really any of them.
Yeah. What was your major at Calvin?
It was sociology.
Oh, really?
So yeah. So one thought was to become a social worker, or live in that kind of world. So. And what was yours history, Paul?
Yeah, mine was history. Yeah. And I didn't declare my major till my 4th year at Calvin, so I had to do a 5th year to get all my Greek in. So I always.
Yeah, it's interesting the choices you make when you're 18, 19 years old and how they kind of live with you, right?
Yeah, yeah. I was doing math and engineering. I was doing all kinds of
Yeah.
things. When did you meet Jerry and how?
Yeah, so I met Jerry the spring of our freshman year. We were both assigned to be resident assistants in the same buildings. So, for those who don't know, Calvin has these dorms with 3 floors of men's dorm on one part of the V and 3 floors of women's on the other part of the V, and that's held together by a lobby. It still is. And then there would be 2 RAs per floor on the men's side and 2 RAs per floor on the women's side. And then the 12 of you would meet with your resident director and you'd become a team. So we first met in that spring, looking forward to being RAs together in the fall. And we started dating in the spring of our sophomore years, if that makes sense. So sometime yeah, you know how it is. You don't want to date someone at work right away. So you got to take your time, right?
So when did you marry, actually?
We married a year after we graduated. So we graduated together. She went off to Stanford for a year. I went off to Fuller for a year. And then we married after that. We expected to live in, well, she was looking for jobs in Michigan so we could go back to Calvin Seminary. She, for a while, had a job in Southern California, and then I was going to stay at Fuller. But the job, so she was going to teach at a Christian school, and she was going to teach math because that's her major. And there was, this list of 180 questions you had to answer before you were deemed okay in that school. And one of the questions was, do you drink alcohol? Well, there was a 7, I think literally there was like a 7 options. There was, I'm a lush, I drink over excessively, all the way to I drink, once in a while, I drink once a month, I don't drink at all. Well, she was just to the left of I don't drink at all. And they asked for a 3-page statement on her consumption of alcoholism. And while they're asking for that, Calvin College calls and says, we are looking for people with a master's degree to teach business math. Would you be willing and interested? So within a week after our marriage in Modesto in June of 1983, we're now in our Ford Pinto with our tent heading back to Michigan. So yeah, we would say Providence maybe, but the things that nudge your life in a certain direction, right? Pretty
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your sojourn to Fuller. What's with that? Kalamazoo, Grand Rapids, Pasadena.
Yeah.
Why'd you go? Why'd you go out to Fuller?
You've lived in Michigan. You get a choice between Michigan and Pasadena, Paul. How short of a conversation is this? So I think there was always something in me that both loved the kind of tradition I was given, but also wanted to kind of expand it or at least expand my experience of it. So I think that's just kind of part of who I came to be. And then my junior year, they had these things at Calvin, they still do, called interim lectures. So there's like a semester, an interim, and a semester. The interim is 3 weeks. You take a morning course or you take an afternoon course, and in between are these lectures from people all over the world. Pretty remarkable. My junior year, there was this guy named Lewis Smedes who spoke at that lecture, and he had taught at Calvin for a while. His faith story in some ways had paralleled mine in terms of growing up the way he did. But when he spoke, something in me said, I want this man to be my teacher. Like I want to be this person's student. So, I mean, yeah, so right away that seed got planted inside and it grew. And then when Jerry was off to Stanford, for me to go to Fuller just seemed very kind of like a natural way to go from Calvin University to then literally across the street to the seminary. Didn't seem very satisfying to me at the time, but instead to see kind of the scope and the breadth and the diversity of the church at a place like Fuller, where I was exposed to lots of pretty interesting people and interesting things, right?
How did how did your time at Fuller impact your view of the church?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it really expanded it. I mean, I was hoping that it would. I mean, the CRC, as you know more than most, is a pretty diverse and interesting group of people, but then any tradition has its boundaries, let's say. And so now I'm at Fuller, where probably the two main groups at the time were charismatic, like Assembly of God folks, in terms of students, and mainline Presbyterians. Well,
Hmm.
that's quite an interesting
Yeah.
group. And then you have everybody in between and besides that. So I had teachers like David Hubbard, who was president of Fuller. They were on a semester system, so I took 4 courses in three. They're on a quarter system, so I took 4 courses in 3 quarters with Smedes. Um, I had Roberta Hestenes, who went on to be the president of Eastern
Yeah. Eastern
University.
College. Yeah.
Yeah, Eastern College. I had Ralph Martin,
Yeah.
wrote a number of commentaries. So, you know, you're reading Colin Brown in seminaries across the country. I'm going to classes with Colin Brown. You're
Yeah.
reading commentaries by David Hubbard. I'm listening to David Hubbard. And this guy named Richard Mao floats in and out, and I'm kind of captivated by this kind of
Now, you could have caught him in West
rascally.
Michigan, though.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah. Um, but I think it did kind of expand your sense about who the church is and what the church is like or what it can be like. And Roberta Heston has had us all join small groups in her class, which is on spiritual formation, which is sort of I don't say in quotes, radical idea. I mean, the Methodists did it in the 1700s, but it wasn't a common thing back in 1983. And so I'm with a Wesleyan person, a Reformed person, a charismatic person, and so it goes. One of the courses I took was by a guy named John Wimber. So it was called Signs, Wonders, and Church Growth. So I was in this course. One of my buddies from the Roberta Hestenes class and I are auditing this class together. There's about 400 of us in this room because he's got a binder of healing in the Bible and examples through church history. So they're up there sensing God's call to heal people in the room. And my buddy who's next to me, they come down the aisles, and I'm both interested and a skeptic, call me reformed or whatever, about what's going to happen. And all of a sudden, this Wimber's right-hand person will say, one of the leaders with him whispered into my friend's ear. He fell off his chair. He's doing convulsions on the floor. And I thought, well, this hadn't happened in any Christian Reformed church I'd been part of. So this was pretty interesting. So then they speak words of healing, and they're literally trying to teach us to be agents of healing in that sense. And like later that night, and then the next couple of days, he unpacks what had happened with him. And there was this secret sin in his life. And this person had whispered, I believe that this has happened to you, and that God is just here to say he forgives you and he loves you and he wants you to be healed. Now, if you whisper the cynic side of me says, if you whisper this into 10 men, you're going to be right like a third of the time. But I don't mean that to be snarky, because for him, this was a really powerful, life-changing experience. My hunch is that wasn't going on at Calvin Seminary at the time when I was a student there. So yeah, the church gets big, right? It gets really big.
Yeah, your stories, you got kind of have a nice Forrest Gump quality to your story at Fuller. I mean, you hit
I've been
all the
called a lot
biggies
of things, Paul.
in a little bit of time at Fuller. I mean, to actually be able to to get into that became partly because of Smedes, a
Yeah,
very famous class at Fuller. Smedes, of course, wrote this little booklet, which I've got over there on should you celebrate a miracle. So
right.
you were really there at the right time and the right place.
Yeah, I really was. I think about that both at Calvin and at Fuller. The teachers that I was able to have, I still think that I'm a janitor's kid from Kalamazoo, Michigan, that I get to be exposed and learn from these teachers is really kind of a marvel in serious ways.
I should tell the audience that my first memory Kevin Adams is when I started at Calvin Seminary. Originally, I was not going to go to Calvin Seminary. I was going to go to Fuller. And now
Oh,
hearing all of your stories, I feel like I kind of missed out, but I had fallen in love with a undergraduate at Calvin College. And I knew that if I moved to California, that would have been Scotch. So my friend Mark Van Heitzma, who currently serves up in
oh,
Washington
yeah.
State, he went to Fuller, and I stayed back at Calvin. So then you begin your Calvin seminary with your Hebrew class in the late summer. And so then you have the Hebrew class, and you're getting into your Hebrew class, and the language is all new, and you have this different alphabet, and it's all kind of cool. And then classes start. Then you have the seminary retreat, where you go out to this camp in Western Michigan. And I'm just a first year student at the seminary, just kind of keeping my eyes open to everything. And at this seminary retreat, a big conversation erupts, seemingly semi-spontaneously, about whether or not it is beneficial to the mission of Calvin Seminary if a certain faculty member is witnessed to have a jelly donut dripping from his mouth. The discussion was, should the faculty of Calvin Seminary be, rubbing shoulders with the student in the student lounge, or should they stay huddled in the faculty lounge? And a certain Kevin Adams, I remember, challenged the faculty that they should get in there and, hobnob it with the students. And so that was my introduction to Kevin Adams, the famous, at least those of us who were there, the famous jelly donut story with
Yeah, right.
I'll reserve the name of the Calvin faculty for now, but that was my introduction to Kevin Adams. How did it feel going? So you're in Fuller, you're out in California, the weather's beautiful, the library closes at 10 o'clock at night, Mark Van Heitzma said, not 12 o'clock, as all of us in Western Michigan under our gray
Right.
skies were laboring. And you've got John Wimber, and you've got Lou Smeeds, and you've got Roberta Hestenes, and you've got Ralph Martin, and we've got, God bless his soul, Fred Clouster teaching us prolegomena. What was it like going back to Calvin Seminary?
Yeah, it was well, it was familiar in some ways, right? Because I knew some of the folks in the Hebrew, and Hebrew is like a weeding out class. Yeah, it was sort of like what they do to law school students. If you can't learn Hebrew in these 3 weeks, you're not going to make it as a minister, which of course none of us believed, but this was a 100-year tradition somehow.
There are some in this channel that will take umbrage at what you just said, but go on.
More on that later, maybe. Yeah, so yeah, it was difficult. I'll put it that way. It felt pretty formulaic in certain ways. I was a little bit always then out of the box because I had done this year. There was a very prescribed, as you know, there was a very prescribed 3-year curriculum plus a 1-year internship. And it was very prescribed what you would take first year, what you take second year, what you take third year. And most of those years you're with the same people. So you're clearly identified as a junior, first-year student, middler, second-year student, or senior, I think, third-year student. Well, I was taking class, I had taken this class, I didn't need that class, my schedule didn't really fit. So the good news was I met a whole group of people. I don't know if it was bad news, but I was never sort of pegged into one of those classes. For me, it didn't immediately have the vitality, like there was no Roberta Hestenes talking about small groups. There weren't a sense of the spiritual disciplines. There was Louis Burkhoff's systematic theology and a curriculum that had probably been unchanged for a remarkably long period of time. So at the same time, like Neil Plantinga was one of my professors and yours too. And I mean, Neil's really an introverted person. He's not going to be having donuts probably up in the faculty lounge or the student lounge. But there was a vitality with Neil. And then I had this guy, Lyle Bierma, who was subbing for a history class. There was a vitality with Lyle. So it was in places, but it didn't, to me at the time, feel like it was in the whole. So it was tough sledding. One of the sayings people would have at the time, I don't know if this is your experience, Paul, is I'm going to seminary not because I want to go to seminary, but because it's a means to an end. It
Mm,
was something you
mm,
would endure, might be a little strong, but it's something you went through so you could become a pastor at the other side.
mm.
Um, it was not a pleasant or really attractive experience, and yet there were pockets of growth and vitality. Part of it's the conversations with fellow students. Part of it's people like Neil, people like Lyle. There's others I'm not thinking of right this second. That yeah, make any place come alive, right? So, but it was tough. It was tough sledding for a while, and then I was only there a year actually, and then my wife Jerry, who you referred to earlier, her mom came down with cancer, like bone cancer in lots of
Mm.
places. And so then there was this internship because at the time we had to do a 1 year internship. So again, I'm out of order. You're supposed to do like junior year, middle year, then do your internship, then you come back. If there are extra like permissions, then you can do all 3 years and then tail one on at the end. But so I had a year at Fuller, a year at Calvin, and now I'm doing this 1 year internship, which was one of the first two, I'm kind of digressing a bit here, but it was one of the first two non-nucleus church plants in the CRC. And I just kind of happened to be in Northern California. It just kind of happened. The reason, my wife Jerry and I kind of were talking about this, and I thought, as a young couple, I thought she'd want to stay at Calvin because she's teaching at Calvin. She's ready to say, hey, if we can go to be Michigan or go to California to be near my mom, I'd love that, even if it means I lose this unique job. So I apply for this Monday morning. The only reason the mentor supervisor is there is because it's cheaper to fly out on Tuesday back to California than Monday. It's Providence again, right? So he's driving from Holland, Michigan, where his wife's parents live, to Michigan to Grand Rapids for this last minute added interview with this crazy nut who didn't think to apply in the month preceding, thinking, who is this
Like
Yahoo?
everyone else, because there's this whole system where you get into the internships and everything. I remember
Yeah.
that.
So I think it was within 10 minutes of us starting the conversation that we thought I think on both sides, it's like, I think this is going to work. And yeah, so we spent 14 months in the middle of seminary in Fairfield, California. And when we drove out, we thought, oh, this will be a really interesting kind of stretching experience. When we drove back, we thought, we're supposed to plant a church. We don't know where, we don't know when, but we do know now, after having been here for 14 months, this is part of God's call in our life. So
Let's talk a little bit about, because this of course will play in a lot of what we would then do here in Sacramento. Let's
right.
talk about that moment of the Christian Reformed Church sort of getting in on the much broader evangelical game of church planting. And of course, your connections with Fuller don't hurt that, because the church growth, I mean, all of this stuff is sort of coming out in the 1980s. And the Christian Reformed Church, as you described, I mean, in a lot of ways, your life nicely has many of these elements. You grow up in Kalamazoo, you have these little West Michigan enclaves, high walls, thick culture, thick tradition, but you go out to California, your wife's from Ripon, that's a little bit more, it's not sort of the deep water of Western Michigan. Ripon's a pretty good sized pond, but it's closer to some other things. Talk about what you saw happening in the church, and why, as a seminary student, you're like, wow, maybe just sitting on the other end of the table from when I was taking profession of faith isn't just what I want. Maybe something else. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, that's good, Paul. It's hard to separate all these threads, right? Even
Yeah.
looking back, sometimes they get clear, as you know, sometimes they don't. But I do think, I mean, there's something in me already in that junior high part of my story that said, hey, I think the church can be more than it is. I I think as a 12-year-old, I already thought there's well, through my baseball league, through my work at a grocery store, which was in a completely different neighborhood than I had experienced, or completely different kind of group of folks than I experienced at school. Um, I make, I don't want to say exposed to, but I'm connected to a number of folks from a number of different backgrounds. So I think it's something inside me, and then that something kind of grows because of environment and experience.
Don't forget cutting lawns, Kevin.
Yeah,
You gotta make that connection.
that's right. That's right. Well, seriously, those are all meeting folks outside the bubble, aren't they? I mean, there is a thread there. And then at Fuller, yeah, I mean, it would, yeah, there's a sense of there, I think, imagining, well, I'll put it one way. You and I both were exposed to the treasures, I think, of the Christian Reformed Church. And like any tradition, it has treasures. You know, when I was a freshman, I didn't know what classes to take at Calvin University. And my advisor, you've probably heard me tell the story, Paul, my advisor says, well, there's this guy named Nicholas Walterstorff who's teaching Intro to Philosophy. You need to take Intro to Philosophy. You should take it with him. And I'm like, all right. I mean,
What do you
so,
know?
so what do I know? So I'm now in a freshman philosophy class with Nicholas Walterstorff. My sophomore year, I need to take a mid-century philosophy class to now go on to seminary, right? Well, I happen to take it with Alvin Plantinga. So again, if you know the CRC tradition. So I think there was part of me that thought there are these wonderful traditions, there are these wonderful kind of thinkers that in a secular context like California could really sing. So I think that begins to kind of coalesce or come together. The irony is, I'm not sure the good folks who planted that church in Fairfield, I'm not sure they had the same thing in mind, but I learned from them, I think, that you can drop some folks in the middle of quote unquote ecclesiastical nowhere and begin a new congregation, which they did, God bless them, just by sheer grit and staying power. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting combination of things. Sometimes you can kind of identify strands, and sometimes even after all these years, it's a little bit below the surface, right?
Well, and at that time, so of course my story intersects with the old way of let's say home missions in the Christian Reformed Church, the church that I grew up in, the church that my father really transformed from sort of a mission outpost, was called Northside Chapel. You'd have these chapels in the denomination, and these chapels were just sort of permanent. You know, they're similar to what we had in the Dominican Republic, these Campo Blancos, sort of these permanent places where you might have lay preaching, you might have the music would be a little different. I mean, the rules would be a little different in these chapels. And then you had the real churches.
Yeah.
But with the church growth movement, you get this intentionality about maybe planting a church in this community where there, even when Sacramento Christian Reformed Church was founded, Frank DeYoung went through the phone book and found any Dutch name he could and called them up, just figuring better than even
shot.
chance.
Yeah.
And we're going to start a Christian Reformed Church. Would you like to come? And then you gather a few dozen diaspora CRC folks who landed jobs in Sacramento after the Second World War. And, that's how you plant a Christian Reformed Church. But then suddenly the Christian Reformed Church has this idea: we're going to plant Christian Reformed churches in places where there aren't any. And of course, there's a much larger movement going on in the United States, planting churches. I made the lawn mowing conversation. Kevin had a little Kevin cutting the grass for Bill Hybel's mom's yard. Rick Warren down in Southern California. And of course, Fuller is an instrumental piece of this entire movement. And the Christian Reformed Church is kind of over on the side. Bill Hybels, son of the church in Kalamazoo, works in this youth ministry and, in a church in Chicago, and then plants Willow Creek, which becomes an important thing. Home missions in the Christian Reformed Church starts looking at that, and a little bit of collaboration. And so, something obviously grabs your attention. Now, looking back on it, Fairfield is, it was a non-nucleus start, but it didn't quite. It's definitely going to in some ways set up when we finally get to you and your wife going to Rockland, California, what this will happen there. So that internship is pretty foundational.
It really is. It really is. Yeah.
Okay, so you do your internship, you come back, you get the you do your board of trustees interview. So you're gonna leave Calvin Seminary. Your first call.
Yeah, so my first call at the time, there were these things called residence church planters, residencies. So the idea would be like a medical residency. You've graduated, you've done all your academics, you go on site, and like there's a hospital or a teaching hospital, there'd be a church. This would maybe be a teaching church. You would do a residency in this church, and then within an hour or so uh, of geography, plant a church. So there were two residencies the year I graduated. One was a Korean-speaking residency, which I was completely underqualified for. The other was an English-speaking residency, and it was in Fairfield, California. So it came down to two people, a guy named Neil and me. And they told me years later that they picked Neil because he looked older than I did at the time. Now, I think if we had a pretty healthy HR system as a church, there might be some discussion about whether that's the right way to make it. But the bottom line is there was no residency for me. And so I ended up in a small town Minnesota context. I had a chance to be a youth pastor in Chicago. I had a call or inquiries there. I had a chance to be pastor in Portage, Michigan, so right in my backyard growing up. And then another opportunities. But this church in Minnesota was the daughter church of a long-standing 100-year-old enclave church. And the folks there earnestly wanted to reach their neighbors and considered themselves kind of really open to and interested in that. So that combination of their openness and willingness to take on a new pastor with maybe new ideas or other ideas coalesced. It was just a beautiful group of people. I never thought I would live in a small town. I never thought I would like it, but it was a wonderful place to preach twice a week, to hone some preaching abilities and experience, to lead a church in a different, with a council that will be there before you and be there after you, which is its own kind of different dynamic than a church plant. And so that was and we made some good friends there. And our oldest son was born there. So it was a good experience. But all during that 4 years, I told them at the beginning, hey, I feel like I'm called to plant a church, and I don't know when, and I don't know where. And there was a time where I thought maybe it would be in Minnesota. And I was part of the church planting, kind of the home missions committee, if you will, of our classis, our region of churches then. So there was a chance of that, but yeah, eventually ended up in California. So all the way along, I know I'm going to plant a church. And about 3 years in, this guy named Peter Howarda, who was the regional director, he's kind of like leading church planting on the West Coast. He said to me, we'd like you to plant this church in Rockland that we're thinking about. And I thought, I don't know. And I kind of twisted in the wind. And how do you make a decision to leave your church in Minnesota? How do you do that? And eventually, my wife and I decided if we did this church planting thing, we needed to know this is what we were supposed to do, just as clearly as we could. And so we turned it, after a lot of soul searching and asking for an extension, we turned it down. And then over the next months, I found myself waking up thinking about this church plan. I found myself, then I go back to the church planting agency, Home Missions, and say, hey, I know I said no to the call, but if you call me again, I'll take it. And it's a thing.
We won't talk about you and job offers and saying yes and no, Kevin. We won't go there.
We won't go there. We won't talk about the clarity required sometimes, right? So that, yeah, we could draw threads there too, couldn't we, Paul?
Yeah, we sure could. So anyway, now, and of course, that site is that's not very far from another Christian Reformed church that had been planted there years before. And I'm sure that church was really wanting you to come out and plant a sister church not too far away from it so that together we could reach the city of Sacramento. Is that the way that went, Kevin? Uh-oh.
Well, if my friend Paul Vanderklay had been pastor there, that is how that would have gone. But my friend Paul Vanderklay was not yet pastor there. So this church about 40 minutes away from where we planted in a city, a broader metropolitan area of 2 million people, said, we have 100 people. We do not want to share any of them with you. I mean, I'm 40 minutes away thinking nobody's going to drive that far. I have no intentions of what's called sheep stealing, taking. So they said, we're not going to support this enterprise. And so the denomination needs a calling church that's existing. So they leapfrog what's now Living Stones, where you're at, as you know, and a church from Ripon, which is 85 miles away, then becomes our sponsoring church, which on some level doesn't make any sense, but there are good folks there too that we got to know, right? So, yeah, whether it's church plant, there's a lot of fear in churches, as you know, and the idea of when you're at a threshold, you think we can make it with 100 people, but if we lose 10, can we make it with 90? I mean, that and a whole pile of other fears and inexperience. By the time, I sort of showed up in July of 91. By the time we planted in April, I feel like we had made some inroads and some friendships there with a lot of your folks who are still there, they were really, I think, enthusiastic about the enterprise by that time. So that really talks about the kind of, once they get past their initial fear, what kind of folks are there. Yeah.
So what was it like to come to a place where you don't really know anyone? I mean, Rick Warren, of course, you can read Purpose Driven Life. Rick Warren has told his story on and on and on about him and his wife. And, a lot of times I read those stories and it's like, I bet you there's some other things that you're not talking about in terms of connections. And what was it like showing up cold turkey in a place and saying, we're going to plant a church?
Well, I appreciate what you're saying, Paul, because a lot of times people say, well, it's just me and my wife or just me and my husband. And then you think, yeah, there's a 600-person youth group, or there was like a 200-person college ministry, or by the way, I grew up in that neighborhood until I was a senior in high school. And so they pose it as one way, but it's not that way. Ours truly was a parachute drop. I remember, so we did everything you can think of, right? We did door-to-door kind of stuff. I went to all the people selling new houses. I went to realtors. I went to City Hall one day, I'll never forget, and asked several questions to the person at the desk, and finally exasperated with me. I think she was just hoping to write a check or have me write a check and move along the line. She said, well, why are you asking all these questions anyway? And I said, well, we're here to plant a church, and I'm just trying to get to know the neighbors. We want to make sure our church can serve them and connect with them. Ah, she says to me. I said, is that like not a good thing? Ah, she says, lots of people come and try to start churches here. They don't last long. So like for me, that's where I think my experience at Fairfield with this dogged, relentless determination of that individual planter and kind of the ethos of the CRC, which is not a here's 6 months salary, knock yourself out, but it's like, we're going to sustain you. We're going to help you transition. I thought, and I think inside myself, I thought, I think you might be wrong on this one. So, but there is a lot of loneliness in church plant, both for the planter and I think maybe especially for the family. Every relationship is new. Every relationship is fragile. I would say for the first 8 or 10 years, my wife Jerry and we were 31 when we planted the church, 30 when we showed up. We had been Christians longer than anybody else in the church, like as adults. So there's like a built-in fragileness. There's a sense of which we don't know how the CRC works or any church organization works. That's beautiful in lots of ways because you're reaching the people you want to reach, but it also means that fragility is with you a long time. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that I'm sure you quickly realize is that you don't show up at someone's door and say, here's a copy of the Heidelberg Catechism. Read this through and let me know what you think of it. And we'll have a conversation.
Yeah, right.
That doesn't go so well. And you wind up, I mean, you've spoken again about, all of this, you sort of grow up in this thick insular culture. You've got the differentiation between the Reformed Church of America and the Christian Reformed Church. You go to Fuller in a much broader perspective. Now, suddenly, church plants are sort of this mixture of some people who are already committed Christians, some people who are a little Christian curious, and this little opportunity is intriguing for them, and they'll have one motivation or another to join the group. Other people for whom this Christianity thing is an entirely new, and you as the pastor is sort of taking all of this and trying to put something cohesive out of it and actually have it, in the Christian Reformed sense of the word, have it arrive at being in somehow a Christian Reformed church, which will be very different from the one that you grew up with in Kalamazoo, Michigan. What was that like for you?
Well, that's another good question, Paul. There weren't a lot of models for this, right? There were a number of folks in California who were a couple years ahead of us, so to speak, and so that was helpful. There's this guy Al Breams in down south in the Temecula area, but in that sort of range, Moreno Valley. So one helpful thing was just having some relational. I didn't come with those relational connections, but through some gatherings on the West Coast over the first 5 years, let's say, I got to know some of these folks. So that was helpful. And yet, I don't think we were very good at the CRC of articulating this, but I think there's a sense in which a church plant is some combination, some chemical mixture of the personality and the priority of the church planting group, whoever that is, or persons, the DNA of the mothership, so to speak, or the mother denomination, and the local context. And you kind of put those in a blender a little bit. And over time, you're trying to articulate. So you'll take a Christian Reformed church brochure, 40% of it works here. So now I think if I'm pastor of a church in Holland, Michigan, I can just put this on the back table and you're good to go. But if I'm a pastor in California, now I have to redo that and rework that. And there's a sense, I think, for every church planter, you have these ideals, and maybe you learn something from Fuller, maybe you learn something from a Baptist friend up the road, maybe you learn something from a Wesleyan friend down the street. But one of my working theories after about 8-10 years is you don't really know what you're committed to until you'll suffer for it. Like we had CRC background people who early on said, well, how are you going to welcome all these new people? Because we had, I kind of break our early church into 4 groups. There was, I'm not a Christian quarter. There's the, I became a Christian here in the last 2 to 5 years quarter. There's the, I've been spiritually homeless for 5 years or more, 25%. And then there's the, I'm transferring from another city into this city. All of those are sort of new to the enterprise, right? So they all come, it's a little bit like Men in Black, I think, Paul. You come and you've had this experience and you bring this experience with you. And part of you as a pastor wants to give them that little whoop, whoop, whoop. So I know you're Baptist, but like that's not gonna work here. I know you're Episcopal, but that's not gonna work here. I know you used to be a CRC, but that kind of CRC isn't gonna work here. And you kind of want to go whoop and help them. So we really, I think it was Neil planned, it's interesting how things go through your mind. I think, I thought to myself, what would Neil do here occasionally? Not all the time, but for me, he represented the best of the tradition. So it wasn't kind of like an obligation so much. It was like a touchstone for me, which, yeah, I think one of our deep calls is there's some church plants, as you know, it's like, let's chuck the CRC. We don't really care. We're going to shrink that. I think one of the priorities for us is like, no, this is like a treasure. We want to share the treasure, but we want to do in a way where it's accessible to folks for whom this is a kind of a whole new idea. Yeah.
I should say something here, which is a friend of mine named David Snapper, who's I mentioned with my little CRC videos that I do sometimes. David Snapper was a church planter up in Washington State, way up north. He did a pretty in-depth study on CRC church planting and numbers. And one of the things that he discovered is that for the most part, 80% of Christian Reformed churches can succeed if they're planted within a community where there's 2,000 people already in established Christian Reformed churches with Christian schools and those kinds of things. Those types of Christian Reformed church plants tend to succeed. Very, very few Christian Reformed church plants succeed where there's nobody around. And so Kevin is Kevin is really one of these exceptional people in Christian Reformed church planting history who actually managed to plant a Christian Reformed church in an area where there wasn't, the little Sacramento Christian Reformed church didn't have anywhere near enough population to impact those numbers and was too far away. So Kevin's story is really quite exceptional in terms of the Christian Reformed church and planting churches. Now, so you have another book. Let's see, you've got 150. I should have pulled all your books from my shelf. You've got 150, you've got Gospel and a Handshake, and now you've got this book. And I think, the best way to understand your books, and I'll put links to them in the notes below, that will make Erdman's very happy, I'm sure. The best way to understand what and why Kevin is writing is exactly this point that he's making with respect to figuring out how to plant a church that isn't necessarily Baptist. It isn't necessarily sort of a least common denominator of the Christians that he can sort of gather in an area who have moved into town, but to actually do something that's faithful to the treasures of the Christian Reformed Church and yet make it something intelligible and accessible. Now, before we get to the book, I do want to talk a little bit about like all of us, and so we as a cluster that we called it, we were bringing in interns and residents and helping to plant new CRC churches here. And that would, that's an interesting story. I've had Dirksen on the channel a long time ago. So we've had some of those cats on this, but you also had a little pastors group in the area that had some really rather wonderful colleagues outside the denomination. Talk a little bit about that group and the role that group played, and really sort of how that group begins to fit into something like this.
Yeah. So when we first got here to plant the church, there was a pastor, a Presbyterian Church of America pastor in Roseville, who was about 3 or 4 years ahead of us, doing virtually the same thing. There was the PCA, the Presbyterian Church of America, requires there to be a founding elder in the neighborhood. So there needed to be some connection or core, but basically he was a resource and an encourager, and unlike our not calling church, was glad we were in the area when we were a lot closer to him. And so he, about 8 years into our church, came to me and several others and said, I'd like to start a group. This is in the Promise Keeper days, if that's a whole nother kind of story. But a lot of people were meeting in groups, and a lot of times they would talk about accountability, kind of holding each other faithful to our vision and our ideals, that kind of thing. So he came to about 4 pastors and he said, I'd like to start a group, and I'm thinking we could be accountable to each other. And we were all like, nah, we don't want to be accountable. I mean, that just sounds like, not that we don't want to be accountable, we just don't want that to be the lead of the group. But we're like, if you're talking about hanging out and mentoring each other and friendship and supporting each other, we all are on board with that. So it sounds like a joke. What happens if you put a Presbyterian person and a Reformed person and a Wesleyan person and a Vineyard person in a bar or a coffee shop? And so this, in some ways, I think this extends, some of the stuff that I was able to experience at Fuller, some of the stuff along the way, to say, we have our CRC, Christian Reformed Church accent, but we really are Christian. Like the main thing, I have people in our church will say to me, what are we again? One of my neighbors wants to know what kind of church this is. What are we again? So there are some churches, like within 5 minutes, we're Baptist, we're Baptist, we're Baptist, we're Lutheran, we're Lutheran, we're Lutheran, we're Catholic, we're Catholic. Well, that's not, we're Reformed, but it's like we're Christian first, right? And this other group shared those sensibilities and sensitivities. And this really becomes a mentoring, like a mutual brotherhood, an encouraging and mentoring group together. So because it meets our group as a cluster, we could call each other anytime, but we meet once a month and you kind of go over things once a month. This group was an every week, most of the time group. There's a different kind of pace and a different kind of vitality, both unique and helpful in their own ways. But this was just a wonderful gift. One of us along the way, One becomes an army chaplain and goes off, and we add an Orthodox priest to the mix. And Chris, God bless him and love him, lost his wife several years after he got in the mix. David, about 7-8 years ago, died of pancreatic cancer. So now the group has really been through significant things together. And it's really been one of the gifts of my life, Paul. I mean, both groups, but this idea of having other pastors, other people you can go to and rely on and be there for you during good times, ordinary times, or more trying, complicated times, has been really helpful. Yeah.
So now you're a church planter and you've got this church, and people, of course, sort of wander in because there's some relationship to it, or they have a little crisis in their life, or maybe they have someone in the family thinks that maybe going to church would be a good idea. And of course, people are all over the map in terms of something like baptism. Some of the people were baptized as infants. Some of the people were never baptized at all. At least, in a Baptist church, you've got you're gonna, well, we'll dunk you again just to make sure that it's good and done.
Yeah.
Now what's behind writing a book like this? How did this one begin?
Yeah. So at our church at Granite Springs, we're always looking for ways to bring people together. Like sometimes we'd say, we have people from maybe 30 or 40 different Christian traditions. I mean, if there are 350 in the United States, that's not so hard to imagine there's 30 or 40 in one modest-sized church. And we're looking for ways to bring them together. Like, what are the best of the traditions? So we spent a year memorizing scripture. Well, if you ask someone, hey, do you want to memorize stuff? They'll say no. But I said, well, and then they'll say, I'm terrible at memorizing. We'll say, of course you are. Let's not memorize together. The Lord is my, shepherd. They know that one, even if they didn't grow up in church. So that, Orthodox, Catholic, Lutheran, Baptist, we're all on board with scripture memory as a spiritual discipline to feed our faith. Similar with Psalms, like psalm use is a special thing of the Christian Reformed Church Reformed tradition. But really, everyone loves this prayer book of God's people of all times and places. Athanasius, this saint in the 300s called the Black Dwarf from Alexandria, Egypt, said it's the anatomy of the human soul, and John Calvin picks this up in the 1500s. So again, once we get into the Psalms, everybody's like, oh, that lament, that pain, that anguish, that celebration, that brings us together. So we've done that a couple times, and then came the idea, what about baptism? Could we talk about baptism in a way that would bring us together, not separate us? Well, there was a lot of pushback when I first floated this idea. You feel your pastoral authority can leave quickly for lots of reasons, right, Paul? But, people are like, you want to talk about baptism? Well, that's a good idea. Do that on your own time, because it'll start fights and squabbles. But we said, no, what if it's about identity and not how much water, what age of life? So then we tried to help people tell their stories of baptism, and we didn't judge. Someone's baptized at a pool, someone's baptized in a jacuzzi, someone's baptized in a Catholic church, someone's baptized in a Baptist church, someone's been baptized 3 times, and we just kind of took those stories, but we kept focusing and drilling down on identity. That the beautiful thing here is, well, like God, the Holy Spirit whispered, the Father and the Holy Spirit whispering over and being present at Jesus' baptism, this is my son in whom I am well pleased, and said, what if baptism is about that? So when we baptize someone, we do this old Orthodox tradition, big O Orthodox tradition of taking aspergillum or a hyssop branch, or in ours, the California redwood branch, and we fling water into the crowd for people to remember their baptism. And the first time we did that, I thought, well, how's this going to go? Are people going to run for the hills, run for the exits? And how's this going to go for people who haven't been baptized specifically? And one woman, I tell this story in the book, but one woman, she's been in and out of religious stuff all her life. She, in her words, tried drugs and sex and rock and roll, and nothing kind of took hold. When she got flung with water and the water hit her, it was like she was healed and she became whole. These are her words. And it was like she was put back together. And so, I mean, there's a story where it doesn't matter how much water there was or wasn't, it doesn't matter what age she was. Baptism was this healing event in her life. And we imagine, so suppose you're a 5-year-old kid or a 16-year-old in high school or a 28-year-old, and someone just, this happened in our church, that someone got a text from their spouse, my wedding, our marriage is over, by text. But now then you say, oh, that's terrible. That's terrible. And it's also true that I am the one with whom God is pleased because of what Jesus has done for me. It's like this, at the core, my identity is not I'm popular in high school, I'm a 5-year-old, or I'm this happily married person with 2.3 kids living in the suburbs, but I am baptized. And then that becomes a life defining script. And so we wondered together, what would that look like? And so the book really comes out of a year of that, working on that together, focused work, but really kind of a lifetime of that in this congregation, right? And it just kind of, the nice thing is it kind of happens to resonate with other folks from other congregations as well. Not everyone, but a lot of folks anyway.
It's, you know, the chapter, there's different parts in the book. There's part 1, baptismal identity; part 2, baptismal liturgy for life; part 3, baptismal abuse; part 4, baptismal hope; and then the epilogue, a baptized imagination. Part of the reason I wanted to, very much get Kevin, I've actually wanted to get Kevin on the channel for quite a while, is in a lot of ways you can know a lot of Kevin by reading the book. If you've enjoyed listening to sort of Kevin's manner, the stories, that's very much how the book is written. This isn't a theological treatise on baptism as much as it's sort of a narrative journey through the meaning of baptism, the practice of baptism, the history of baptism, and it's very much filtered through the stories in Kevin's ministry, ancient stories in the church tradition, sort of brought over. It's a very accessible book. I think, in terms of, you don't have to be a theologian or have to go to seminary to read a book like this. This is very much a book for, well, I think, you wrote it probably with an eye on the people of your church.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Paul. And I try to say at the beginning too, and you said it so well, like there are a lot of other books about the history of baptism, and there are other books about the doctrine of baptism, and there's other books about the nuances of baptism and the systematic theology, taking baptism and studying it from Genesis to Revelation. But this was really aimed to be telling the stories of baptism as it applies concretely in the lives of people. And you're right, it comes out of our church with all the mess of a local church. And then some other friends have trusted me with their baptism stories, and there's a mess in their church as well. And it turns out baptism is messy, but it's also this beautiful kind of, one of the old favorite images of the church is it's an anchor. So our baptism is something that anchors us to Christ. And I think we all need an anchor. So it's kind of helpful.
Well, let's throw some questions at Kevin, and I'm going to do this because I have a lot of confidence in Kevin. Like one of the chapter titles is Kiddie Pool Piety, drowning in a coffin, renouncing evil. In fact, on just one of the comments recently, I forget what video it was on. My videos there's so many of them, they're so rambly. Someone asked, does the Christian Reformed Church renounce evil in its baptisms? What would you say to that, Kevin?
I would say historically that's not been part of our form. And we're big, if this person's from a Christian Reformed background, they'll know we're big on forms. And in certain ways, in other ways, I think to our detriment, we literally make it up. I talk to pastors new and old who literally make things up. Well, I think the ancient wisdom of the church is you don't make it up. You use the old forms, but you word them maybe in a way that helps the local context optimally. So I would say it's not typically been part of the baptismal form, but starting in the 3rd century, it was part of every baptism liturgy that we know of. And on one hand, this idea of turning our back on evil is part of the practice of every church. But to name it in baptism, yeah, like I said in that chapter, and it's probably I have an Orthodox friend or more who say, you're always like 2 steps from really becoming Orthodox. Well, that may or may not be true, but I think the Orthodox are onto something here when they say that this is the inherited tradition and there's wisdom in that. And as a matter of fact, we can think about our baptism as dying and rising, and part of what we're dying to is some of these specific temptations and travesties, frankly. Like, yeah, we could be specific, but baptism is one way to turn our back on some things the church desperately needs to turn their back on.
Oh, I knew a woman. She was actually, again, it's on CRC Voices for many years. She was in upstate New York. She came into the Christian Reformed Church from the RCA. She was in a very liberal RCA. And she came to the Christian Reformed Church. She was frustrated because she didn't think the Christian Reformed Church treated gays very well. But the thing that she loved about the Christian Reformed Church that she joined is they didn't allow women to limit women to serve in any of the offices. And these are the kinds of jumbles of things you get with real people in the world, not sort of these plastic people that we project things to. She had been baptized. She had become a Christian in her early adult life. She was a generation older than us. She'd very much been part of the baby boomers, and it had sort of a rebellious young life, and then found Jesus, probably something adjacent to the Jesus movement. Got baptized, and then when she was a senior citizen, she took a trip to the Holy Land, and there they have a Jordan River thing, and so she decided she wanted to be baptized again in the Jordan River, and so she got baptized again in the Jordan River. And on Voices, she would talk about just how special that baptism was. Well, one of the things that, again, I mentioned this really amazing conversation with Mary Worthen on the Gospel Coalition YouTube channel. Mary Worthen, she was baptized as an Anglican because she kind of was feeling a little bit guilty about being a professor of Christian history and not being a Christian. So she decided that probably the most sort of upstanding and respectable church she could be a part of was Anglican. But then she really sort of had an experience with a Southern Baptist church, and Tim Keller somehow got into the mix. And of course, the Southern Baptists wanted her to get rebaptized, and she decided she was not going to do that. In that Southern Baptist church, they all have to wear these black T-shirts that says "Jesus has me" or "Jesus in my place," something like that. And she looked at that and she thought, I'm a professor of church history. I, initially joined the Anglican church because I wanted something respectable. And now I'm going to have to go through in this Baptist church wearing this silly black T-shirt, getting baptized in front of a praise and worship band. And I'm sure the place has a smoke machine. So there's a lot of messiness when it comes to baptism here. What would you say to people who say, I was baptized once, but maybe it happened when I was an infant, but don't remember it. Or I was a kid and I didn't know what I was doing. And then I led this dissolute life. And eventually I came back to Jesus, and I really mean it now, but I'm joining Granite Springs, and doggone it, Kevin, why won't you baptize me again? I mean, what do you do with that?
Well, as you might guess, Paul, I've had those conversations, and I've had multiple versions of those conversations, going all the way back to the earliest days of the church, where someone talked about getting blank-faced and dancing on top of barroom tables, and her baptism didn't mean anything. And she tried to talk me into rebaptizing her. And a lot of my church planting peers were rebaptizing folks without a second thought, frankly. But what I'd say to this person is, well, I do. First, Father Chris and I would both probably ask the same questions. Who baptized you? Was it your neighbor at the kitchen sink? That's one kind of, because that literally happens, right? Was it your cousin or uncle in the bathtub at one point? Those. But if it was done by a faithful not even faithful, but if it's done by a legitimate representative of a local congregation, if it was done in the name of the Trinity, and I would poke around in that, then I would say, the God made promises to you, and he kept those promises. I would say there's all kinds of promises happening in a baptism. You are saying it to the best of your ability, or your godparents or your parents are saying you're going to be raised as a child, you're going to, or of God, or you're going to try to live as a child of God. So you're making promises. The church is making promises to you as well, saying we are going to, in the CRC, we're all kind of godparents all at the same time. We're all here to say we have a vested interest. We will pay financially for you to go to a Christian school, or whatever it takes for you to grow up in the faith. But the big promises are coming from God. The big promises aren't coming from us. The big promises are coming from God. And I'd say this person, and God has kept his promise to you. And the fact that you are saying, I want to be baptized, is a wonderful symbol that your baptism has now taken hold. Maybe it was always there, it's always part of your life, but now it's coming alive in you a deeper way. If I was at, I've had a couple chances to be at the River Jordan where some of these kinds of things are happening. And a number of our church folks, as you might imagine, have taken those trips with other churches and said, that was wonderful. I would do it again. I feel so lucky I was baptized in the Jordan River. Okay. But what I would say is, if at that moment you want to remember your baptism, and it may sound like you're playing games, but I take this on John Whitblade's authority. He's done a lot of research on baptism. He's a great liturgist of the church. There's a difference, I think, between remembering your baptism or being baptized again. Earlier, we talked about profession of faith. Sometimes when we have people make profession of faith or join the church, it's obviously much more dramatic to be baptized. We'll have them stand in the same baptismal pool that the folks about to be baptized will stand in. So they're up to their thighs, or up to, you can imagine someone up to your waist in water. And I don't think it's fast and loose to saying this is remembering. This is not another baptism, because I would just lean back into Paul and say there is one Lord, one faith, one baptism. And I think he's not just talking about Lutherans accepting Orthodox backgrounds and Orthodox accepting Baptist baptisms, but it's truly one. And that's where I begin, Paul. That's a pastoral conversation. So where exactly you begin depends on the person you're having a conversation with. But that's where I'd start anyway. Yeah.
Who do you think should read your book?
Well, I think I'll tell you who has read it and found it helpful. So I have a friend who grew up CRC, and then as a teenager years ago, her dad left the CRC and they went charismatic, and then kind of floated between a variety of churches. And she got married a while back, and they go to a big church in Colorado, she and her husband. She's been rebaptized as in her Assembly of God Pentecostal adolescent days. Her husband keeps getting pressure from this big church to be rebaptized. She, for a variety of reasons, got my book, gave it to him, and he said, finally, this shows why my baptism is legitimate. Like, it's really, so maybe couples who want to have a peaceful marriage, that would be a place to start. But honestly, I think people who want to kind of make sense of their baptism, people who have questions about their baptism, people who are curious about how baptism practices today connect or don't connect with the early church baptism practices, I think might be interested. I think people who are interested in how Christianity affects politics. I have this chapter on baptismal identity and politics, and how baptism is really the first thing a Christian said. The first thing a Christian says about themselves: I am baptized. I'm not American. I'm not Czech. I'm not a person from the Czech Republic. I'm not Mexican. I'm baptized. Well, that then becomes the lens at which I look at all my. It's hard to be an excessive nationalist and be baptized in a way where you're really being thoughtful and living into your baptism. I think it could be helpful as a pastor. You'd pay $20 for a good story on Saturday night before you preach, and so I think the book is probably helpful just for the stories. You could find one or two if you ever preach on baptism. I think that'd be helpful. I think anybody who's connected to baptism as a parent or as a participant or as a leader in the church could conceivably find it helpful. That doesn't narrow down very much, does it, Paul?
No, but it's good. And I know that, Kevin, before I started recording, Kevin said, well, give me a sense of who we're talking to. And it's like, Oh gosh. I have a hard time. Probably the easiest way of sort of summarizing a big piece of this audience are people who are one way or another feel themselves sort of misfits in their religious tradition. We've got Jews who are excited but not actually observant. We've got people who are one way or another going in or coming out or keeping Christianity at arm's length. We've got people who are excited about natural law or just like good stories and conversations. And so I think actually for many in my audience, if you want something accessible on baptism, you can find a lot of theological books about baptism. You can find a lot of books that sort of are written by different church Christian traditions who want to sort of sell their point on baptism. That's not really this book.
Right.
This book wants to sell you on baptism.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Paul. And going back to earlier, when you're a Christian Reformed church pastor in a church plant, you can find those. Here's why our baptism is right brochures. I really like what you're saying, because there's always this variety of people at our church, including people I say from 30 or 40 Christian backgrounds, and then a whole bunch of people from the I don't have a Christian background. Those folks are always in our view, are always part of the conversation. I would be really interested in hearing from someone who says, I'm not a Christian. I'm not sure I believe in any of this stuff, but baptism might be a way in for me to make sense, whether I accept it or not, for me to make sense of the deep wisdom or of the church through story, because I think there's a number of people have noticed there's a whole section of what baptism is not, or to put it differently, abusive baptism. And there might be some folks who say, what I resist the Christian faith for is what I see should be resisted in some of these chapters as well, whether it's nationalism or race, a long-term history of racism, or forced baptism or obligations, those kinds of things. So I'd be really interested in having those conversations, actually.
Okay.
Be a lot of fun.
So I will put Granite Springs Church, Lincoln, California. You can go to their website. I'm sure find some button to click to get at Kevin Adams to talk to him. I'll unleash the randos on Kevin and see where this goes. Now you and I, Kevin, are both now within a decade of retirement. You and I have both been serving the church in one way or another for better than 30 years. Now that we are entering our last decade of professional ministry, what are some of the things that you're thinking about, and what are some of the things that you'd like to that you're pondering as you're thinking about what it means to end well and what we can hand off to the stewards who are younger than us?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, Paul, because you've been part of this in so many ways, and we've been colleagues in this in so many ways. I think both our congregations consider ourselves like teaching churches. If you think of a hospital, there's also where they do medicine. There's also hospitals where they kind of teach medicine, how to do medicine. And we've long thought of our church that way as well. So one of the things that gives me hope and a sense of anticipation about the future is the interns we've had over the years. And we have this really brilliant person who's come back and starting a culture house, kind of like an art house within the neighborhood. Those sorts of things get me excited. Young leaders. I'm sitting in Matt's office. He's just on paternity leave. So I think seeing these, and Q Han, who's been part of our church, who's now in the military, he's exploring what it means to either extend in the military or maybe come back to Northern California. I think those kinds of things, and having those kinds of relationships and setting folks up as best you can to flourish in their calling, is something I'd for sure like to give myself to. One of the things, this, and there's a chapter in the book on healing and the healing power of baptism, how that's supposed to happen. I was diagnosed with Parkinson's, as you know, 3.5+ years ago. well, nobody says, boy, sign me up for Parkinson's. That's what I'd like to have. And so there is a sense of like, there's a fragility or a sense of it's one thing to know you're going to get something. It's something else to have the thing that you know is going to get you at some level. And at the same time to say, how can I live faithfully with that? I feel like there are people who would listen to me now with a little more street cred because I'm speaking as someone who lives with a shadow. And we all, frankly, as a pastor and a person, we all live with shadows, but my shadow is a little more public than some folks' shadows. So there's some opportunity and maybe some calling in what that means. Part of, as long as I can, I'm committed to going on pilgrimages, probably in the summer. So like our church is going to build a labyrinth as part of its 30th anniversary celebration. So that a labyrinth is a bit like a pilgrimage at home. Without leaving home, you go on a pilgrimage, right? And there's other ways to think of that's probably a conversation for another time. But my wife and I were able to walk the Camino about 500 miles last year. This year, we're going to walk part of the Canterbury Trail. So if you heard of the Canterbury Tales, they were told on the Canterbury Trail, which is this Thomas Becket pilgrimage. So that kind of works for me, both health-wise and spirit, like every step is a kind of prayer. And it also connects with the global church and the historic church. So I think just kind of leaning deeper, like maybe one way to say this, you kind of hope even now that I could become a better Christian. I mean, at some point you're like, man, Lord, this is all I got, I'm sorry. But on the other hand, you think you just kind of want to lean into these disciplines in different ways. One of my favorite things to do is to hang out with young leaders. And so I get to do that. Sometimes in church planning circles, we take folks to monasteries, and they don't have to be church planners. We take folks, part of this thing called Cultivate Renewal, where we take folks, and it's really a retreat where we listen and engage in the disciplines of prayer and silence and meditation. So those sorts of things. And I think you have this too, Paul. I still really love to preach. Like if sermons are pretty humbling. They're sort of like parenting. It's just Eugene Peterson says children are God's gift to us in adolescence. And their adolescence is God's gift to us to keep us from thinking we know it all. That's really true. And sermons are a little like that too. So I mean, I could go on, but those are some starting points, I think. Yeah.
Okay. We're reaching our 2-hour mark. Anything you wanted to say, or anything you want to ask me, or anything that's sort of in the back of your mind that you want to get out before I end the recording?
Well, I'm curious, if you give me the microphone, Paul, I'm curious how you think about living your own baptism. Like we're both been around the block a couple times, and here we are in churches. When we began this church, no nucleus church, people said, how long are you going to be there, Kevin? And I said, well, at least 8 to 12 years, I think. I mean, I don't know, but it's going to take a while to get this thing up and going. Now it's been 32 this summer. For you said it's 27, 25. Is it? 25?
Yeah.
So I think part of it is like, what does it mean to die and rise at a particular place with a particular people? But anyway, I don't need to set you up. You can handle the question without a setup.
Well, my father spent 36 years at Northside. So, and Kevin will testify to the fact that it's been 20 years since I've been saying this church isn't going to last. And Kevin always laughs at me.
He has failed. I just want all your listeners to know you are a failure at closing down that church. You have failed spectacularly, Paul.
we just repaved the parking lot.
Well, that's a sign you're going to be there in a while.
At a cost of $55,000, probably half of it came from donations via the channel. There's, I don't know if we have a picture of my baptism. We have a picture of my older sister's baptism. It was in my father's church at that point, the building that I would remember growing up and going to church in. That building had not yet been built. It was a little storefront. In fact, someone Um, Someone sent me, someone was going through old banners and they sent me a clipping of the Northside Gospel Mission with a picture of the storefront from a banner from the probably 1960 or something. And we have a picture of my sister as an infant being baptized there. And let's see, the building that I remember was built in 63. And so I don't know, I'll have to ask my mother if I was baptized in that building or another, but I think something that looms large on the minds of many in the Christian Reformed Church is they have children that they baptized as infants who now are no longer, they may or may not have made profession of faith. They are out there in the world wandering around, and parents are anxious about, well, what about those promises? What about what does God speaking? Okay, we get that from the Christian Reformed teachings on baptism and a washing away of sins, et cetera, et cetera. I think about the ways that God, I always tell people don't play chicken with God, because you will blink far sooner than God ever will. Because God takes journeys and paths that we can't imagine. And part of the brilliance of God as storyteller are these journeys that people take. And, I never would have imagined that 5 years ago when I made us, just kind of I was making the Freddie and Paul show. And then I, made a video about Jordan Peterson, that I would in any way be doing the kinds of things that I'm doing now. And, you and I have both had very interesting careers. On one hand, sort of being way out on the fringe of the denomination. On the other hand, I mean, you're currently on the board of Calvin University. We've both been on denominational boards, served committees. So I just don't think you should count God out of things. And this baptism, these baptisms that happen are there's more to it than you can imagine. And that's, one of the things that I think, working in a place like we do, you get a very healthy sense of just how big and broad the world is, and how patient God is in weaving our stories together. And, part of the reason that we went all the way back to the Netherlands with you this summer, I had my first chance to go to the Netherlands, and we went to Appingedam, where you go to, there's a little synagogue, and on the memorial of that synagogue are all the Van der Kleys that were taken out of that village by the Nazis and killed. And my father, remembering his father saying to him, if we lived in the Netherlands still, we might be in some trouble during the Second World War. And to think about, my great-great-grandfather sending my great-grandfather across the ocean at the age of 18 over to Spring Lake, which is just by Muskegon, and then, joining a Reformed Church of America church. Why on earth? As Jews, I have no idea why they did that, but they did. And at some point, then, my great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather and, we had then all been baptized, and having really interesting conversations with a bunch of very interesting Jews that have connected to me through this channel has brought all sorts of interesting conversations about baptism and Jews getting baptized, and a lot of the tensions and stories with that. So I just don't think you can so easily count God out of the breadth and the diversity and the mystery and all of the things that we just can't sort of get our minds around that baptism is sort of one lens that you can sort of look at and see, sort of like a river flowing in this, dry American Western land, how God sort of continues to do his movement in this world. Well, that sounds like a whole bunch of word salad. I don't know if that made any sense.
That was beautifully said, Paul. It made total sense to me, and I think it'll make sense to other folks listening. It's interesting how, you tell stories, and these stories connect to these deep truths, and the deep truths connect to the stories. And sometimes they're personal, and if they're part of the church, for us, they're all personal.
Yeah.
And even if someone's not part of the church, they're still pretty interesting and possibly captivating. Just the power of these stories and the God who works through beyond us. I mean, because at the end of the day, I think there's a good place to end. It's really beyond us.
Yeah.
And that's the way it should be.
Yep. Well, so for anyone who's watching, I think one of the things that I often get the comment, well, you're not like other pastors. And, it's never quite clear exactly what people mean by that. Sometimes it's a positive, sometimes it's a negative.
Right.
But I think people listening to Kevin will get a sense of this missional context that I think has shaped both Kevin and myself, in terms of the people that we are now, with respect to, I think, a real sense of the breadth of the church. It's kind of a posture of mere Christianity, both a flexibility and sort of a security in one's core. And I think to work fruitfully in the kind of mission field that we both do, that's sort of the balance you need. You need to know who you are, and you need to be able to connect with others. So, all right, Mr. Kevin, I'm going to stop the recording.
Paul. Yeah.
But thank you so much for giving me your time.
Oh, well, it's great. We said 2 hours, and I thought, Paul, 2 hours, really? But it went fast. And so it always does between the two of us, right? It always does. So it's just,
do you not watch Joe Rogan? 2 hours is just table stakes, baby.
And I like what you said. There's a lot of YouTube out there, and a lot of it needs to be kind of planted with more Paul Vanderklay.